The current is more than a spat. It's a serious dispute between Alberta and BC. The federal Liberal government is firmly behind the Kinder Morgan pipeline expansion. The provincial NDP government is turning up the heat on BC to get out of the way. So with the Liberals and the NDP fighting the good fight, as it were, what's left for you but to cheer them on?
Well, Terry, for months I was asking Premier Notley to put some action behind the words about this pipeline, to say that if the NDP government in BC were to use dilatory means to block this pipeline that proved by the federal government under federal jurisdiction, and in so doing break the Constitution's promise of an economic union. If they do these things, I said, there must be consequences. And I've listed a range of consequences. I think I support the initial step on wine. It's only a $70 million trade versus billions in oil, but at least it catches the attention of the NDP government in British Columbia, demonstrates that we are serious about defending free trade in the Dominion, and but there must be other consequences if they proceed with their plan arbitrarily to shut down the export of our major product. So the Prime Minister could stop this tomorrow, though, with federal action.
So if you were Premier, what would you do? Well,
I've always said you start with diplomacy and persuasion. If that doesn't work, you start with certain trade sanctions, and we've begun with that. But I'm prepared to go all the way up to the consideration of the stopping periodically the shipment of oil and gas through the oil through the current Kinder Morgan pipeline, which fuels much of the Lower Mainland economy. Peter Lougheed did exactly this in stopping the shipment of oil to Ontario in the early 1980s to protest the national energy policy. The NDP in British Columbia needs to know that we mean business.
So you'd say to them, let them freeze in the dark.
That's your way of putting it. I think if BC consumers were to wait, I think it was actually Ralph Klein, but if they were to wake up one morning and see, $4 a litre for gas, they might ask what their political leadership has done to compromise their standard of living.
Now, you said a moment ago that you thought the federal government should do more. I've heard you speak of the declaratory power in the Constitution. I believe there's a section, is it 9210? That lets Ottawa, and that lets Ottawa assert jurisdiction over a project in the national interest, supposedly. So, would that change anything?
Yes, absolutely. Now, first of all, the federal government has clear jurisdictional authority over inter-provincial pipelines. It could go to court, we believe, and seek and obtain an order suspending any application of these regulations threatened by BC. Secondly, it could use the constitutional sort of nuclear option, go to Section 9210C, declare that this is in the national interest. The federal government has done this over 400 times in our economic history. And,
well, not recently.
It's been, yes, you're quite right. It's been since before not used since the Second World War, but it's still a live power in the Constitution. Peter Hogg, our leading constitutional scholar, confirms that. Here's the point. There's no doubt the feds have jurisdiction. What we need is leadership. It's not good enough for the Prime Minister to say he supports the pipeline. He has to put that into action. If not, the opponents of this pipeline, which represents hundreds of billions of dollars of future wealth, will try to kill it through delay.
But it's already under federal jurisdiction. But you've already said it's an interprovincial pipeline. By definition, it's already under federal jurisdiction. Saying it again, what difference does that make?
Well, it says it. What I'm proposing is they say it with the force of law, either by getting a court order to suspend these BC regs or to invoke that constitutional power. So that makes null and void any BC regulations that would purport to stop the free shipment of this product. And there's a broader point here, Terry. In terms of the environment, do you think that Qatar or Venezuela, Iran or Saudi Arabia are going to stop shipping their oil to global markets? Of course they're not. So all the opponents are doing is bottling up energy resources from the Canada with the highest environmental, human rights and labor standards of any major oil and gas producer in the world. I say instead, there's a moral cause for us to displace oil coming from conflict regimes, or at least compete with them in global markets.
Okay, but before we finish with this declaratory power, the Prime Minister said yesterday, and he said before, I believe, in San Francisco, that BC has done nothing specific that the federal government could take them to court about. If he's wrong, well, what exactly could they be sued about? You said purported resolutions or regulations. They could fight that, but they haven't made any yet. They've announced things.
They've done something a couple of things very specific. Coming to office last July, they said they will do everything they can to stop this pipeline. Now they've specifically said they're going to do consultations and potentially use regulations to specifically try to stop the shipment of bitumen oil through that pipeline. Here's the problem. That kind of talk, that creates uncertainty. That uncertainty affects the investors behind this pipeline. Here's their strategy. It's to kill it through delay. So the Prime Minister can sit there and pretend with clean hands that he supports it while the opponents manage to death through delay. And that will have massively negative economic consequences for all of Canada. This is not a quarrel with British Columbians. The majority of them support this project. They support environmentally responsible resource development. It's a quarrel between Canada, its economic interests, and the NDP.
Well, one way to make it a dispute with the people of British Columbia would be to have a wine boycott. How does punishing wineries who never said boo about the pipeline, how does that help?
Let me be clear. I love BC wine and the folks in the Okanagan. And Albertans spend a lot of time and money there, but I'll tell you something. We have to start somewhere, and this is a relatively minor, disproportionate. I mean, this is a modest response. We're talking about billions of dollars of future energy sales versus $60 or $70 million of wine sales.
Now, final thing on the carbon tax. You've called for Alberta to suspend the carbon tax to pressure the federal government to do more. Wouldn't that be exactly counterproductive in as much as you'd be aiming at your ally in this affair instead of at your enemy?
So Premier Notley brought in a large Alberta carbon tax on the premise that it would get a so-called social license to eliminate opposition to pipelines. The opposite has happened. Since she introduced it, Justin Trudeau vetoed Northern Gateway, Barack Obama vetoed Keystone XL, the NEB effectively killed the Energy East pipeline, and now the British Columbia New Democrats and Green parties are threatening to kill Trans Mountain. So I think it's time for the Premier to acknowledge that her carbon tax social license theory is a total shambles. It's a failure. Let's stop it. If she can't persuade her own New Democrat comrades in British Columbia to support this pipeline, then she should come out and say she's going to scrap her carbon tax. So why would you punish Alberta consumers without getting 1 inch of pipe in the ground?
Ready for any question, as always, Jason Kenney, the United Conservative Party leader and leader of the opposition in Alberta. Thanks.
Thanks, Terry.